You're watching Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. We've been tracking some exclusive reporting from the Wall Street Journal saying that President Trump is weighing an initial limited strike to force Iran into a nuclear deal if authorized. The action could come, they say, within days. They say the president is still considering a range of military options, but still prefers diplomacy. President Trump saying that the U.S. may make a deal with Iran within, quote, the next probably 10 days. Standing by is Professor Alon Burstein. He is the host of the Palestine-Report. A lot to break down, a lot changing, a lot of developments just within 24 hours time alone. What we've been doing here tonight is we've been showing questions from the people who are watching at home. And that includes David in Washington, starting off with, do you believe there is anything that Iran's current leadership can do to stop what might be coming? What is Iran's easiest off-ramp at this point, Alon?
Good to see you, Austin, and thank you, David, for that opening question. There are things that Iran's leadership could do to stop what's coming, but we have to understand that within the context of what are the premises of what Iran believes it can do internally. Because theoretically, Iran could just say, you know what, we are abandoning the nuclear program, end of story. They could also say we're stopping to support our proxies. They could say we're stopping to develop our ballistic missiles. So all those things are what I think the United States, Israel, some of the Gulf countries would like Iran to do. But then we also have to understand this within the context of what Iran's leadership believes that it can get away with internally. And internally, Iran's leadership has more of a problem. They are bound to a lot of their own rhetoric, and that says you need to have us as the leaders of the revolution because this is part of God's mission to export the revolution and bring about Shiite revival. With that, that is then a problem to come and say, but because of international pressure, US threatening to bomb us, we will give up our nuclear program, we'll give up our ballistic missiles. That is the reason that we're hearing two opposing rhetorics coming out of the leadership. On the one hand, internally, they are saying we will never give up the nuclear program, and it's a peace program, we'll never give it up. No one will limit our ballistic missiles, we're not willing to talk about that. Then in back channels, they're saying to the United States, well, under certain circumstances, we might agree to certain things in response to sanctions being lifted. So there are things that Iranian leadership could do, but I think it's less about what they could do towards the United States and more what they think they could get away with vis-a-vis their own people while still justifying all that they have done to stay in power.
So what I want to kind of talk about here is the range of options that we could see play out in the immediate future. I've seen a number of news outlets say that we could see the US do something as soon as this weekend. Some outlets say in a matter of days. The phrasing is different depending on where you read. But the Wall Street Journal says that an initial strike would be designed to pressure Tehran into an agreement, but it would fall short of a full-scale attack that could inspire a major retaliation. Again, all I'm talking about right now would be a potential initial strike here. So as things stand tonight alone, which is Thursday night, does it feel like the US is poised to do something militarily, regardless of how the current round of negotiations goes?
Look, the United States has brought into the Middle East the largest amount of soldiers and the largest amount of ships and military equipment that it had since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So right now, the United States is certainly acting as though it is prepared for a massive war and is prepared to throw the entire might of the United States into Iran. I would say that it is possible that the United States might actually consider some sort of limited strike almost to justify this, because if all this is being brought in, mobilizing such an armada costs millions of dollars in fuel, in logistics, and all these armadas are around the world. They are now leaving places where they're usually stationed in South Asia, areas in the North Arctic Sea. They're all coming to Iran. They'll have to go back once this is over. So it is possible that they'll even carry out a nominal strike just to say there was reason to bring all this. That's pure speculation on my part, but that could be one of the reasons that they might consider this. Another reason is that right now we are in very much a stalemate. We've been in a stalemate already for some time, and it is growing with every day and with more US armaments coming to the area. That stalemate is growing. On the one hand, there is no illusion that the United States has the firepower to overrun Iran's air defenses. We saw that Israel had the power to overrun Iran's air defenses during the 12-day war. Certainly, the United States has that power alongside its allies in the region, Qatar, Jordan, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. Certainly it could do that. That said, the United States does not want to be engaged in a war of invading Iran, does not want to take over Iran and try to take over Iran. The United States has bad experience with that in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we're in a stalemate. On the one hand, the United States has brought in all this force. They're saying to Iran, acquiesce to what we want. Look at the amount of guns we have pointed at you. Iran is saying, we know you don't want to actually engage in a long-standing war. You could, you don't want to. And I think that the idea of this preemptive strike might be to sort of break the stalemate, to tell Iran, look, we are willing to take another step further. We don't want to yet. I am not certain that it would break the stalemate, because all that would actually show is, in fact, the United States does not want to engage in this. The United States right now could launch a massive attack on Iran. If it's not willing to do that, if it's still saying, the game of chicken, I'll take one more step forward, but I'm still not going to actually run in, I think it may pressure Iran, may also still leave us, though, in the same stalemate that we're in right now.
So Axios' Barak Ravid has this. You've likely seen this. It's a translated statement from Iran to the UN. They say if we are attacked, all bases, facilities, and assets of the hostile force in the region will be considered legitimate targets within the framework of Iran's defensive response. The United States will bear full and direct responsibility for any unforeseen and uncontrollable consequences. Alone, let's say that a U.S. operation does trigger a retaliation. How much clarity do we have on what the Iranian military is capable of?
So Iran's retaliation is divided into several different options. First, they do have an advanced ballistic missile system program, and that can reach many, many places in the Middle East. The farthest targets that they may try to reach are Israel. They also have US bases, located in Turkey and places like that, but it's unlikely that they would risk dragging Turkey almost against its will into this. So it is very likely that they would first of all launch an attack on Israel. And in Israel, they're already openly talking about the fact that there would be attacks likely on Tel Aviv, likely on Ramat Gan, the main cities, the largest cities, the areas that Iran has proven that they can strike. In the beginning of the 12-day war, a lot of their ballistic missiles were intercepted. By the end, most of them were not intercepted. So that would be one avenue, is direct strikes on Israel. Another avenue would be also using ballistic missiles to carry out direct strikes on US bases, US interests. Iran would probably be very hesitant. They wouldn't want to, poke the bear even more. But if the United States is throwing all it has in already, then they might do that. So that's one avenue, is ballistic missiles. Another avenue is using either their Navy or their regular military in order to disrupt international oil trade and the shipping routes. They can do that in the Straits of Hormuz. They can do that by either laying mines, underwater mines, or just targeting ships using surface-to-sea missiles and targeting ships. They can do that in a lot of ways that, again, would be a direct military engagement, but not so much with US forces, instead actually with the region, with Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, disrupting the world's shipping in a way that would seriously affect the United States and cause a lot of pressure for the rest of the world to come back to the United States to say, stop this escalation. A third avenue is the proxies. A lot of Iran's proxies have been weakened. Primarily, Hezbollah is far weaker than it was if we were talking 2.5 years ago. That said, even though Hezbollah has lost maybe 75 to 80% of their rockets and missiles, we are still talking about 10 to 20,000 rockets and missiles that they still have. Those could be launched at US interests in Syria. They could be launched at US interests in Turkey, certainly be launched in Israel. The Houthis could also be activated. There's also militias in Iraq. So the third avenue is proxies. We have the sort of direct missile attacks, likely at Israel, but also at other US interests, hampering shipping routes. That would be a major crisis internationally. And then also the proxies. And obviously we'll have a combination of these things depending on what the United States ends up doing.
Let's get to Malcolm Malcolm is in Central Texas, in San Antonio. Does Iran have the support of other Islamic nations versus the U.S.?
So it's a good question, and in this we really have to go to the divisions within the Islamic world. Iran is a Shiite country. The Islamic world is largely divided into Shiites and Sunnis. The vast majority of the world is Sunnis. Within most of the countries that we hear about that are Islamic, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Sudan, but also countries that just have a Muslim majority, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Qatar, etc. All those are Sunni. Iran is Shiite. So in that, there is not a natural alliance between them. In fact, very often they are rivals. Iran is a big rival of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is Sunni, Iran is Shiite. And they're big rivals on who's going to be the actual leader of the Islamic world. So the countries that are the sort of natural Islamic allies of Iran are Iraq, that is another Shiite country. Iraq is a very complicated situation because its government is largely backed by the United States, so that's very complicated. And it used to be Syria under Assad, no longer. So those are the natural allies when it comes to alliances in the Islamic world. What there is, however, is more of a regional backing of Iran, not because anyone loves Iran. Most of the region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, the legitimate government of Yemen, they are all rivals of Iran. Where they are sort of backing Iran is that they don't want to see this war escalate. They are scared of a regional war because it'll start between the United States and Iran, but it very likely will not end there. If this thing starts to escalate, Iran carries out attacks, all of a sudden the Houthis are activated, Saudi Arabia starts invading Yemen, then there's pirates from Somalia that will get involved. The region doesn't want this. Most of the Arab regions want stability, they want shipping routes to be open, they want trade routes to be open. So Iran doesn't have natural allies because they're all in the Islamic world, but they do have support from the region in saying we don't want this escalation right now.
A live look at the White House, the time in the nation's capital just past 9:45. So the Journal says if Iran still refused to comply with Trump's directive to end its nuclear enrichment, the U.S. would respond with a broad campaign against regime facilities, potentially aimed at toppling the Ayatollah's regime. Alone, the U.S. nabbed Nicolas Maduro with one pinpoint operation. Would getting to the Ayatollah likely be a much more difficult task?
Absolutely. Absolutely, for several different reasons. First of all, the Ayatollah has spent decades securing himself. He has spent decades building up surrounding defense systems that are very, very tightly knit. And it would be a lot harder physically to get to Tehran than it was to get to the capital of Venezuela. That's just one of the technical geographical issues. Tehran is not near the sea. It's not something that would be easy to invade. Even special forces would then need to evacuate somehow. That would be a lot harder. So that's one difficulty. But the larger difficulty is that unlike the regime of Maduro, here, the entire Iranian regime has spent decades, essentially since 1979, primarily since the late 1980s, since the end of the Iran-Iraq War. The Iranian regime has invested millions upon millions in developing an entire security apparatus that filters all the way down to the citizens. Think of the Soviet Union and the way in which the regime was in control as a dictatorship, but it also had its secret police, then it had its security forces, then it had its civilian volunteers, and all were part of the security of the regime somehow. Similarly here, we have Iran and the leader. Then we have the military. Then we have the Revolutionary Guards. Then we have the Iranian police. Then we have the Basij. The Basij are the more civilian security forces that is part of the local population. All of these, in one way or another, are engaged in ensuring that the regime survives. Why is this important? First of all, it would physically be a lot harder to overcome all of these in order to get to the supreme leader. But more importantly, unlike the situation in Venezuela, where the United States, whether legal or illegal by international law, whether justified or unjustified, the United States wanted to remove the president himself, and that is it, theoretically. The United States now wants a different economy, a different political system, but doesn't want everything in the country to change. In Iran, even if the Ayatollah was removed, he's kidnapped, he dies, he died in natural causes. There is an entire well-oiled machine of religious clerics designed to select the next Ayatollah, designed to ensure that the regime survives. So it means a lot less if you just take out the leader, even though he is extremely important, obviously. But unlike the situation of Venezuela, where the problem, quote unquote, was specifically the president, not the entire system, here there's an entire system. In order to actually have effective regime change, you would need the security forces to turn on the regime, and you need the citizens themselves to actually be part of this. It's not going to work just by toppling the leader in that same way.
Let's wrap up with Chris's question. He says, and it's a hypothetical, if President Trump were to attack Iran and the regime crumbled, would that bring true peace to the Middle East?
It's the question on everyone's mind. What would happen if the Iranian regime would change? On the one hand, the Iranian people have a history of being a lot more moderate, quote unquote, compared to some of the extremist regimes that we've seen in the region. This goes back to prior to the Iranian Revolution, where Iran was a close ally of the United States and Israel and Europe. And there's a lot of hope that if the grip of the regime were to just disappear, Iran would rise up and be, a moderate nation friendly to the West again. But there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, like we've seen in Afghanistan, like we've seen in Iraq, like we've seen in Syria, also to some extent like we saw in Vietnam, if we even go further back in history, it's not that easy to just take away a bad leader, a bad system, and all of a sudden expect that there's going to be now peaceful coexistence in that country. If we look at Arab Spring, if we look when Gaddafi, certainly a bad guy, was overthrown, if we look when different leaders were overthrown throughout the Arab world, what tended to happen was a cascade into massive civil war and carnage, which ends up brooding a lot more violence that spills over borders. Look at Iraq. Saddam Hussein is ousted within 6 years. We have the rise of ISIS, and then that spills over into Syria also. So I wouldn't expect there to be an automatic organic flow, despite what a lot of people think, a flow from the end of the regime towards a peaceful Iran that then spreads out throughout the Middle East. Theoretically speaking, if the regime stopped supporting radical fundamentalist groups throughout the Middle East, obviously in places where they are fermenting conflict, from Yemen to Sudan to Somalia to Israel and Palestine to Syria to Lebanon, obviously there would then be more peace in that area if they didn't have Iran's support. But that said, I don't think that we should expect that if the Iranian regime suddenly disappears, Iran is going to become a peaceful nation all of a sudden. It's going to be a much longer transition than that.
Appreciate you, Alon. How can people track your coverage?
Look me up, the Israel-Palestine-Report. You can find me on my channel on YouTube, constantly uploading summaries on everything that's going on in the Middle East. The Board of Peace for Gaza just met today. Going to have a good summary on that, hopefully a good summary in the coming days.
Alon, appreciate you. We'll see you soon. Good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.